In the fall of 1974, in a small house outside Akron, Ohio, a woman named Linda Pruitt stood over a dead television set with a screwdriver in one hand and a stubborn refusal in the other. The picture had gone dark 2 nights earlier, right in the middle of the evening news, and her husband had already muttered something about driving to the appliance store that weekend. Linda didn't move. She unplugged the set, pulled it away from the wall, and started taking the back panel off instead. What she found inside that evening, and what she kept finding inside broken things for the next 20 years, is the reason we're telling this story today. Somewhere between that dead television and a drawer full of spare parts she never threw away, Linda Pruitt built a habit that quietly saved her family more money than almost anything else they ever did. Stick around, because what she discovered behind that TV panel wasn't just a loose tube. It changed the way her entire household thought about everything they owned. If stories like Linda's feel familiar to your own family, subscribe now, because every week we dig up another forgotten habit from a decade that understood something we've quietly lost. The television that almost got thrown out. What made a housewife with no electrical training pull the back off a broken television instead of simply calling the repairman? For Linda, it started with a number. The repair shop downtown charged a flat visit fee just to look at the set, on top of whatever parts it needed, and in 1974, that fee alone could have bought most of a week's groceries. So before calling anyone, Linda did what a surprising number of households on her street already did without much fuss. She opened it up herself. Inside, she found a single vacuum tube with a visible dark spot near the top, a telltale sign she'd learned from a neighbor of a tube that had simply burned out. She wrote the model number on a scrap of paper, drove to the hardware store, and matched it against a wall of replacement tubes sitting behind the counter, sold individually for less than $1. 20 minutes after she got home, the television flickered back to life in the middle of a rerun, and her husband never did make that trip to the appliance store. This wasn't luck. Televisions in that era were built with parts a determined person could actually access, tubes and components meant to be replaced individually, rather than an entire sealed unit meant to be swapped out whole. Linda's small victory that October evening cost less than $1 and a half hour of her evening. The alternative, a full repair visit or a new set entirely, would have cost considerably more than either. Have you ever fixed something yourself that everyone assumed was already finished for good? Tell us in the comments, because Linda's next repair was considerably harder than a television tube. The toaster test before the trash can. Why did a broken toaster in Linda's kitchen get a full inspection before it ever got to the curb? Because by 1975, Linda had developed a rule that eventually spread to nearly everything in her house. Before anything got thrown away, it had to earn that trip. And earning it meant she had to actually look inside first. When the toaster stopped popping bread correctly that spring, Linda unplugged it, turned it upside down over the sink, and shook loose a small landslide of crumbs that had been building up for months, wedged directly against the mechanism responsible for releasing the toast. She cleaned it out with a butter knife, plugged it back in, and it worked perfectly for another 4 years. This is the part of the story that surprises people the most when they hear it today. Linda wasn't especially mechanically inclined. She hadn't taken any classes, and nobody had specifically taught her how a toaster worked. What she had was patience and a willingness to look closely at a problem before assuming it required money to solve. Many households in the 1970s operated on this same simple instinct, that a malfunction and a genuine failure were two very different things, and only one of them actually required a trip to the store. The toaster cost nothing to fix. A new one that same year would have cost real money the family had already earmarked for something else entirely. What's sitting broken in your own kitchen drawer right now that you haven't actually looked closely at yet? We'd genuinely love to know in the comments below. Shoes went to the cobbler, not the landfill. What happened to a pair of children's shoes in the Pruitt household the moment the sole started to separate from the leather? They didn't go in the trash. They went 2 blocks over to a cobbler named Mr. Iannelli, who had resold half the shoes on that street at one point or another. Linda's oldest son wore through the sole of his school shoes twice in a single year, the way growing boys tend to do. And both times, instead of buying new shoes outright, Linda walked the shoes over to that small shop with the bell above the door. A resole cost a fraction of what new shoes did, and the leather uppers, still perfectly good, simply got a new bottom stitched or glued into place, ready for another full season of scraped sidewalks and gym class. This habit ran deep across an entire generation of households, not because families in the 1970s lacked access to new shoes, but because paying for a repair when the majority of the item was still perfectly functional simply made more financial sense than replacing the whole thing over one worn section. Mr. Iannelli's shop stayed busy for exactly this reason, doing steady business built entirely on the parts of a shoe that hadn't actually failed yet. Linda's son wore those same resoled shoes until he'd genuinely outgrown them, not until they'd worn out a second time. Do you remember a cobbler, a shoe repair shop, or a tailor from your own childhood neighborhood? Drop the name in the comments if you do, because these shops are disappearing faster than people realize. The family car ran on Saturday mornings and elbow grease. Why did Linda's husband Frank spend nearly every Saturday morning underneath the family car instead of dropping it off at a mechanic's garage? Because in 1976, a basic oil change, a belt replacement, or a simple tune-up was something an ordinary person with a manual and a socket set could genuinely handle in an afternoon, and the money saved by doing it himself went directly back into the household budget instead of into a mechanic's bill. Frank kept a thick, grease-stained manual for their sedan in the garage, its pages soft from handling, and he referred to it constantly, working through oil changes, spark plug replacements, and the occasional stubborn belt with a patience that took most of a weekend morning. Their neighbor, a man named Curtis, sometimes wandered over with his own toolbox when a job proved more stubborn than expected, and the two of them would trade knowledge over an open hood the way other households traded recipes over a fence. This wasn't unusual for the decade. Cars in the 1970s were mechanically simpler than what rolled off assembly lines even 10 years later, built in a way that made a home garage a genuinely realistic place to perform real maintenance. A single Saturday morning of Frank's own labor regularly saved the family what would have been a meaningful mechanic's bill, money that went instead toward the children's school clothes or simply back into savings. What's one skill your own father or grandfather had that seems to have completely disappeared today? We're collecting these in the comments, and some of the answers so far might surprise you. A torn couch cushion became a weekend project. What did Linda do when the family's living room couch developed a tear along one of the cushion seams, right where her youngest daughter liked to curl up every evening after supper? She didn't call anyone. She pulled out a sewing kit, a spool of heavy-duty thread, and set the cushion on the kitchen table under the good lamp. Reupholstering an entire couch was genuinely beyond what Linda attempted, but a single torn seam, stitched carefully back together by hand, was well within reach for a woman who had been sewing since she was a girl herself. It took the better part of an evening, working the needle through thick fabric that fought her the entire way, but by the time she finished, the tear was closed tight enough to last another several years of daily use. This kind of small furniture repair ran throughout households across the entire decade, extending the life of couches, chairs, and mattresses well beyond what a family might attempt to save today. A full replacement couch in 1976 represented a meaningful chunk of a month's income for many working families, while a spool of heavy thread cost next to nothing at all. The couch stayed in that living room for another 8 years after Linda's repair, worn but sturdy, holding up through 2 more children who grew up curling into that same corner cushion. Have you ever patched up a piece of furniture instead of replacing it entirely? Tell us what you fixed, because we're always curious how far people are willing to go. The sewing machine that outlived 3 presidents. Why did Linda's own sewing machine, purchased second-hand from her mother in 1968, still sit fully functional on her kitchen counter well into the 1980s? Because when it jammed, which it occasionally did, Linda's response was never to consider a replacement. It was to open the small instruction booklet, still tucked in the drawer beneath it, and troubleshoot the problem herself. Most jams, she learned over the years, came down to the same handful of causes: a tangled bobbin thread, a needle inserted slightly wrong, or lint built up deep inside the mechanism after months of steady use. A simple cleaning with a small brush, done every few months whether the machine needed it or not, kept most problems from happening in the first place, and the ones that did occur rarely took more than 20 minutes to sort out at that same kitchen table. That machine mended school clothes, hemmed curtains, patched Frank's work shirts, and eventually helped stitch together a quilt for her daughter's own wedding, all without ever once needing a repair shop or a replacement part beyond an occasional new needle. Machines built in that era were designed with maintenance in mind, meant to be opened, cleaned, and understood by the person actually using them, rather than sealed away from anyone but a certified technician. Linda's machine outlasted 3 separate presidential administrations and was still running the last time her granddaughter saw it. What's the oldest working appliance still sitting in your own house right now? We'd love to hear how old it really is. Sharpening, not replacing, the kitchen knives. Why did Linda keep a small whetstone tucked in a kitchen drawer right next to the good scissors and use it almost every single week? Because a dull knife, she'd come to believe, wasn't actually a knife that needed replacing. It was simply a knife that hadn't been cared for yet. Every Sunday evening, after the dishes were put away, Linda ran each kitchen knife across that stone a few times, a habit passed down from her own mother, who had done the exact same thing at the exact same hour for as long as Linda could remember. It took only a few minutes, but it meant her knives sliced cleanly through vegetables and meat all week long, rather than dragging and tearing the way a neglected blade eventually does. This small ritual protected the household budget in a way that's easy to overlook. A quality kitchen knife in the 1970s wasn't especially cheap, and a family that replaced dull knives instead of sharpening them ended up spending considerably more over the years than a family that simply maintained the ones they already owned. Linda's knife set, purchased as a wedding gift over a decade earlier, was still the exact same set sitting in her kitchen drawer by the time her children were teenagers. A sharp knife, it turns out, isn't really about cooking faster. It's about never needing to buy a new one in the first place. Do you sharpen your own knives, or have you never actually tried it? Let us know honestly in the comments. The leaky faucet washer kit. What did Frank do the first time the bathroom faucet started dripping steadily through the night, loud enough to hear from the hallway? He didn't call a plumber. He drove to the hardware store, bought a small kit of rubber washers for less than the cost of a movie ticket, and had the faucet fixed before Linda finished making breakfast the next morning. A dripping faucet, in most cases, comes down to a single worn rubber washer inside the handle, a part so small and so cheap that an entire drawer of spares could be purchased for pocket change. Frank kept exactly that drawer, a small tin of assorted washers organized by size, ready for the next leak whenever it eventually showed up somewhere else in the house. This particular fix became something of a rite of passage throughout the decade, a small plumbing repair simple enough that a determined homeowner with a wrench and 10 minutes could handle it without ever picking up the phone. A plumber's visit, by comparison, cost considerably more than the washer itself, often more than the entire tin of spares combined. The bathroom faucet in the Pruitt house went silent again within the hour and stayed that way for years afterward, checked and replaced the moment a new drip appeared. Have you ever fixed a leaky faucet yourself, or is it still dripping right now while you watch this? Tell us honestly. We won't judge. Patched tires and a neighbor who knew engines. Why did a nail in the family car's tire almost never mean an automatic trip to buy a brand new one throughout the 1970s? Because a puncture, in most cases, could be patched from the inside for a fraction of the cost of replacement, and plenty of households, including the Pruitts, knew exactly which neighbor to call when it happened. That neighbor was Curtis, the same one who occasionally wandered over during Frank's Saturday car repairs, and he kept a small tire patch kit in his own garage that got borrowed by half the street at one point or another. A patched tire, properly done, could reasonably last for years afterward, and the entire repair, done in someone's driveway on a weekend afternoon, cost next to nothing beyond a favor returned later down the road. This kind of informal neighborhood expertise ran throughout entire communities in that decade, a quiet network of shared tools and shared know-how that saved households considerably more money collectively than any single family could have saved entirely on their own. Curtis fixed tires. Frank handled basic engine work. Another neighbor down the block, Linda always said, could rewire nearly anything with a lamp cord and a pair of pliers. Nobody wrote any of this down or called it a system. It simply worked, quietly, for years, because everyone involved understood that a small favor given today usually came back around eventually. Did your own neighborhood have someone like Curtis growing up? Tell us who it was. We're genuinely curious how common this really was. The quilt that was never really finished. Why did Linda keep a wooden quilting frame set up in the spare room for the better part of 2 decades, working on the exact same quilt in small stretches whenever a scrap of usable fabric came available? Because that quilt, more than almost anything else in this story, represents the entire philosophy behind everything Linda and Frank did throughout the 1970s. Old shirts too worn to mend again, the leftover fabric from a dress Linda had sewn for her daughter, a swatch cut from curtains that had finally been replaced. All of it eventually found its way into that quilt, square by square, over the better part of 20 years. Nothing with usable fabric left in it ever simply went in the trash. It went into that frame instead, waiting for its next square. By the time the quilt was finally finished, sometime in the early 1980s, it contained pieces of clothing worn by every single member of the family, stitched together into something considerably more valuable than any single item within it had ever been on its own. It wasn't really about the money saved on batting and fabric, though that mattered too. It was about a household that had built an entire habit around asking whether something still had a use left in it before ever assuming it didn't. That quilt still exists today, passed down through the family, carrying pieces of clothes nobody in that house has worn in over 40 years. Would you ever attempt a project like that yourself? Tell us in the comments, and we might feature your answer in a future video. Linda Pruitt never once described herself as handy, resourceful, or especially skilled with tools. She simply believed, the same way an entire generation of households across the country believed, that something broken deserved a real look before it earned a trip to the trash. A television tube, a toaster full of crumbs, a torn cushion seam, a dull knife, a dripping faucet, none of it required special training. It required patience, a willingness to open something up and actually look, and the simple habit of asking one honest question before reaching for a wallet. Could this still be fixed? For Linda's family, across 2 full decades, the answer was almost always yes, and the money saved by asking that question quietly built a level of financial breathing room that buying everything new every single time never could have provided. If this story reminded you of your own parents or grandparents, hit subscribe now, because we bring a forgotten habit like this back every single week. Tell us in the comments which repair from this list you'd actually still try today, and we'll see you in the next one.